The early wind came sharp that morning, mean, biting, like the breath of an old ghost roaming the mountains. Snow fell in slow, heavy silence, draping the pines in white shrouds and muffling the world in a hush only the wild could understand. At the base of the northern ridge, nestled in a crooked wooden cabin that had long since surrendered its paint to the elements, lived Clara Whitmore, a young woman of 27 whose life was as quiet as the snowfall. She had no riches, no internet, no neighbors for miles, just her grandmother, the crackle of firewood, and the whisper of trees. Clara moved with the ease of someone who had learned to live with the cold rather than fight it. Her boots sank into the snow as she trudged deeper into the forest, a battered axe on her back and a sack slung over her shoulder. She wasn't afraid. She had faced wolves, frostbite, and nights so cold her breath would freeze on the inside of the windows. But nothing, not even the warning growl of the storm overhead, could have prepared her for the strange sound that cracked through the wind. A groan, faint, human, hurting. Clara froze. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She turned slowly, scanning the trees, listening beyond the wail of the wind. Then she saw it, a slumped figure at the edge of the clearing, half buried in snow like a forgotten relic. She dropped her sack and ran, stumbling to her knees as she brushed away the frost. What she uncovered wasn't just a man, it was the beginning of everything. Clara's fingers, red and raw, trembled as she pressed them against the stranger's cheek, cold as marble. His skin, pale and waxen, was dusted with frost. His lips were tinged blue. She leaned in close, panic crawling up her spine. "Sir?" she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" A groan escaped his mouth, barely there but real. Relief and fear battled inside her chest. He was alive, but barely. She looked him over quickly. His coat was expensive, the kind city men wore to business dinners, not into snowstorms. It was torn across the sleeve, soaked through with ice and blood. One leg was twisted at a sickening angle. His hair, dark and damp, clung to his forehead. Whoever he was, he didn't belong out here. "I've got you," Clara murmured, looping his frozen arm over her shoulder. "You're not dying in this snow, not today." With the strength of someone far too small for the task, Clara began the slow, brutal trek back to her cabin, dragging the man through knee-deep snow. Her boots slipped, her back screamed, and the wind tore at her face, but she didn't stop. Every time he let out a groan or twitched against her side, it pushed her forward. She didn't know who he was, and she didn't care. She just knew that nobody deserved to die alone in the cold. By the time she reached the cabin, her muscles were on fire and her lips were numb. With a final grunt, she pulled the door open and hauled him inside. The warmth hit like a wave, wrapping around them both as she collapsed beside the fireplace, gasping. But there was no time to rest. She had a life to save. Clara worked in silence, her breath quick and shallow, sweat forming at her brow despite the cold that still clung to her skin. She stripped off her wet coat and knelt beside the stranger, her fingers trembling as she peeled away the soaked layers clinging to his chest and legs. The wound on his shin was worse than she'd thought, a deep, jagged gash caked with half-frozen blood and surrounded by bruising. It made her stomach lurch, but she didn't falter. She lit the oil lamp on the table, casting a golden glow through the small cabin. Then grabbing the kettle of water she'd left warming over the fire, she carefully began cleaning the wound. He twitched at the touch, a soft groan escaping his lips again. "You're still in there," she whispered, her voice steadying with determination. She boiled cloths, disinfected what she could, and wrapped his leg tightly in layers of gauze and flannel. She tucked blankets around him, one after another, until only his face remained visible in the flickering light. The room was still. Snow whispered softly against the windows. The fire crackled gently, and his breathing, shallow but real, became her rhythm. Clara sank into the wooden chair by the hearth, exhausted, eyes never leaving him. His face, though drawn and pale, was handsome. Sharp jaw, high cheekbones, the trace of a man used to power and presence. But there was something else too, something vulnerable beneath it all. She leaned forward, her voice low, almost afraid of breaking the fragile stillness. "I don't know your name," she murmured, "or where you came from, but you're safe here. I promise, Mbachom." The fire had long since dimmed into glowing embers when the man stirred again. his brow creasing ever so slightly. Clara sat up straight in her chair, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, unsure if she had imagined it. But then, there it was, a flicker of movement beneath his closed eyelids, a flutter like the wings of a trapped bird. His chest rose in a deeper breath. His fingers twitched, curling slightly against the blanket. Clara shot to her feet, her heart pounding. "Hey," she said softly, taking a cautious step closer. "Can you hear me?" The man groaned, low and hoarse, barely a sound at all. His head turned slightly, and though his eyes remained closed, the tension in his face shifted, like someone trying to rise out of a dream they weren't ready to leave behind. Clara reached for his hand, not even thinking about it. "You're okay. You're safe now," she said, squeezing gently. "Just hold on." She stayed like that for a long while, murmuring softly to him about nothing and everything. The weather outside, the strange dreams she used to have as a girl, the first time she had ever gone sledding in this very valley. Her voice wove between the shadows and silence, a thread of warmth in the cold. And though he didn't answer, Clara saw something in his face, a softening, a shift, that told her he was listening. Somewhere in the quiet, the stranger exhaled deeper, and Clara, watching him beneath the golden halo of lamplight, dared to believe that this man, whoever he was, might still find his way back. The next morning, Clara awoke to the hiss of the wind pressing against the cabin walls and the faint crackle of the fire, now reduced to embers. She stirred beneath a worn quilt, rubbed her eyes, and glanced toward the couch. The man, Richard, he had murmured the night before, was still there, but something had changed. His breathing was more even, his skin, no longer ghostly pale, had a trace of color. And then, as she moved toward him with a warm cloth in hand, his eyes fluttered open, gray, sharp, and filled with confusion. Clara froze, stunned. "You're awake," she breathed, as if speaking too loudly would send him slipping away again. Richard blinked slowly, struggling to focus on her face. Where am I?" "In my cabin. I found you at the base of the mountain, half frozen. You've been unconscious for 2 days." He tried to sit up but winced, falling back against the pillows with a gasp. "My leg." "You broke it," Clara said gently. "I cleaned and bandaged the wound, but you need a doctor." He gave a dry, weak chuckle. "No offense, but I was hoping I had woken up in a hospital, or at least somewhere with cell reception." Clara smirked, reaching for the cloth again. "You're out of luck. Closest clinic is 4 hours by sled, maybe 2, if the dogs don't decide to take a nap halfway through." Richard's brow furrowed as he processed her words. "You carried me here?" "I dragged you mostly, through snow and wind and some of the worst weather this valley's seen in weeks." She shrugged like it was nothing. It wasn't exactly glamorous. His gaze met hers, something unreadable in his expression. "You didn't know who I was. You could have left me." "I don't leave people," Clara said simply. "Not even the ones who fall out of the sky wearing a jacket that probably costs more than my entire house." Richard gave a faint smile. "Well then, thank you." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she dabbed his forehead with the warm cloth, her eyes never leaving his face. For all his rough condition, there was a quiet strength in him. But there was also something else, an edge of fear, a shadow of betrayal lingering just behind his weary eyes. Whatever had brought this man to her doorstep, it wasn't just an accident. And Clara knew that somehow, the storm outside wasn't the only one he was trying to survive. Clara stood from where she had been kneeling and poured him a cup of pine tea, bitter, earthy, and oddly calming. She handed it to Richard, who accepted it with trembling hands. "It's not gourmet," she said with a half smile, "but it'll keep you warm." He nodded, took a sip, and grimaced. "Tastes like a Christmas tree." She laughed. "You'll get used to it." As he drank, she pulled an old wooden stool beside the couch and sat down. The silence between them was thick, not awkward, just full of unspoken questions. Clara watched him, waiting, and eventually he spoke. "I remember bits and pieces," he murmured. "I was in Alaska for business. I think I was on my way to meet someone. Then the storm hit. I don't remember falling, just waking up here." Clara tilted her head. "Business? Out here? You don't look like the kind of man who climbs mountains for fun." His lips twitched. "I don't. I'm Richard Cole. I run an investment firm in New York." She blinked slowly, letting the information settle. She guessed he had money, the coat, the boots, even his speech. But this confirmed it. "You're a long way from Wall Street," she said softly. Richard looked down at the blanket draped over his lap. "I know." There was pain in his voice. Not just from the broken leg, but something deeper. Clara had seen that look before, on soldiers returning from war, on old men staring at lost photographs. It was the look of someone who'd run hard from something and wasn't sure they wanted to go back. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, looking up at her. "For what?" "For all this, for you having to take care of a stranger. I don't know how to repay you." Clara stood and began adding wood to the fire. The flames sparked higher, casting gold across the log walls. "You don't owe me anything," she said not unkindly. "You were in trouble, I helped. That's how the world's supposed to work." Richard watched her, silent. She turned back to him. "But I will ask one thing of you." "What's that?" "When you're strong enough, you tell me the real reason you were out there. Because something tells me it wasn't just a wrong turn on a business trip." Richard's jaw clenched, but he nodded slowly. "I will." Clara gave him a final glance before stepping toward the small kitchen. Outside, the wind howled, pressing against the cabin walls like a restless ghost. But inside, the silence had shifted. There was something else now, a thread of truth, a promise unspoken. And somewhere, in the stillness of snow and smoke, two very different lives had just begun to tangle together. That night, the snowstorm roared like a beast outside the cabin walls. Icicles clinked against the windows, and the shutters groaned under the weight of wind and ice. But inside, the fire burned steady, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the wooden beams overhead. Clara sat by the hearth, her long hair tied back in a simple braid, flipping through an old dog-eared paperback. Richard lay still on the couch, bundled beneath a mountain of woolen blankets, his eyes half closed. He wasn't asleep. She could tell by the way his fingers twitched every now and then, the way his chest rose and fell just a little too quickly. The silence stretched. Finally, Richard broke it. "Did you build this place yourself?" His voice was rough, still raw from the cold, but stronger now. Clara looked up, surprised. "No, my father did, before he passed." "I figured," he said quietly, glancing around at the sturdy beams, the handmade furniture. "It feels lived in, real." She smiled faintly. "That's a good way to describe it. Real." He nodded, then winced slightly, shifting his leg. "Your grandma, Martha, she doesn't like me." Clara chuckled softly. "She doesn't like anyone at first. She says kindness gets people killed. But once you've survived a few Alaskan winters together, she starts making you biscuits." "You'll know when that day comes. I'll be sure to mark it on my calendar," he murmured. She stood, walked over, and gently checked the bandages on his leg. "You're healing faster than I expected." "Maybe it's the pine tea." Clara rolled her eyes. "It's not the tea. It's your will. You don't want to go back out there, do you?" He looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd woken, there was vulnerability in his eyes. A kind of naked fear that even wealth and power couldn't hide. "No," he admitted, "I don't." She didn't respond at first, just adjusted his blanket and sat back down. Then, without looking at him, she said, "Then don't." The fire cracked. "But I have to," he whispered. "There are people depending on me, things that need fixing." Clara closed her book and set it aside. "Then fix them, but not from the same place you came from." Richard turned to her. "What do you mean?" She looked at him now, her gaze steady and clear. "You were dying out there. Something in your life put you on that mountain, alone, broken, and bleeding. So when you leave, make sure you're walking towards something better. Not just back to what nearly killed you." Richard stared at her, the truth of her words sinking deep into his chest like a stone dropped in water. He didn't respond. Outside, the storm howled louder. Inside, two strangers sat by firelight, one healing in body, the other beginning to heal in soul. Richard lay awake long after Clara had gone to bed, the fire now reduced to glowing embers in the hearth. The weight of her words echoed in his mind. Make sure you're walking towards something better. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that until now. He had built empires, bought silence, negotiated his way out of any problem money could solve. But it had taken a fall into the snow, and a girl with nothing but grit and fire in her eyes to remind him what truly mattered. The next morning, frost etched delicate lace on the windows. Clara was already outside, a blanket of snow wrapped around the mountains, and her axe swinging rhythmically through the morning stillness as she split logs. Richard, now able to move with only a cane, pulled on the thick woolen coat she'd lent him and stepped out into the cold. "I want to help," he said. She turned, surprised, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her glove. "Help? With the wood? With whatever you're doing? I need to learn. I don't want to go back to being helpless." Clara studied him for a moment. "All right, we start with the axe." It wasn't glamorous. His grip was wrong, his swings clumsy, and he cursed under his breath more than once as the axe bounced off the logs. But he didn't stop. Clara taught him patiently, correcting his form, guiding his hands. When he finally split a log clean through, he looked up at her, breathless, and she smiled, not mockingly, but with pride. As the days passed, Richard began to change. Not in the dramatic way television would script, but slowly, in small, quiet ways. He learned to carry water from the stream without spilling it, learned to recognize rabbit tracks in the snow. He repaired a cracked window pane using old tools from the shed and helped Martha prepare stew, even if his chopping skills left much to be desired. Clara watched all this with cautious curiosity. She didn't let her guard down easily. Too many disappointments had taught her better. But something in Richard's eyes told her he wasn't pretending. He wasn't here to play mountain man or to earn points. He was trying to become someone different, someone better. And one evening, as the northern lights rippled silently across the sky, Richard stood next to Clara outside the cabin, their breath mingling in the frozen air. "Do you ever think," he said, his voice soft, "that maybe you were supposed to find me?" Clara turned her head slowly. "I think maybe we were supposed to save each other." They didn't speak again that night, just stood side by side, two souls forged in fire and snow, each quietly realizing they were no longer alone. Winter had its own way of testing people, not just their bodies, but their hearts. And as January bled into February, the snow deepened, and so did the bond between Clara and Richard. It wasn't built through grand declarations or romantic gestures. It was built in the quiet, in the moments when she handed him a cup of tea after a long day, in the way he split the last piece of firewood without being asked, in how he began leaving notes for her, scratched in clumsy handwriting on scraps of paper. Jokes, thanks, sometimes nothing more than, "You were right about the stars last night." He had once lived by power and profit, but here he was learning to live by presence. One afternoon, while Clara was out checking the traps, Richard was inside the cabin, helping Martha knead dough for the evening's bread. His hands, once accustomed only to pens and smartphones, now moved clumsily through flour and water. "You're not half bad at this," Martha muttered, though her voice held a hint of amusement. "I've had a good teacher," Richard replied. She didn't look at him right away, just continued working the dough. "Clara trusts you," she said after a beat. "That doesn't come easy. She's lost more than her share." "I know," he said quietly. "I don't want to be another reason she stops believing in people." Martha gave a small nod, and for the first time her expression softened. "Good, then don't be." When Clara returned, cheeks pink from the cold, she found the smell of fresh bread wafting through the cabin, and Richard, apron dusted in flour, laughing with her grandmother. Something inside her chest squeezed unexpectedly. Later that evening, as they sat on the cabin floor in front of the fire, sipping tea from mismatched mugs, Clara finally asked the question she'd kept locked away. "When you go back, what happens to all this?" Richard looked at her, his gray eyes catching the firelight. "I've thought about that a lot. And? And I'm not sure I want to go back. Not to the way things were. I want to build something that matters. Not just companies. A life." He reached for her hand, not boldly, not with the urgency of a man used to getting what he wanted, but gently, like someone who knew the value of patience. Clara let him. Outside, the wind picked up, but inside, something had shifted. It was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of something whole. That night, sleep came slower than usual for Clara. She lay in bed beneath the thick quilt, staring up at the wooden ceiling as the fire's last flickers danced across the walls. In the silence, she could hear Richard's breathing from the cot in the next room, steady now, peaceful. It amazed her how used to his presence she had become, how natural it felt to pour 2 mugs of tea instead of one, to carve out a quiet life with someone who, not long ago, had nearly died at her feet. And yet, even in the calm, fear tiptoed in. She'd seen this before, people passing through like spring melt, here for a season, and then gone when the snow cleared. She told herself not to dream too big, not to hope too hard, because men like Richard Caldwell didn't stay in places like this. They didn't trade marble floors for wood stoves. Their world ran on noise, not silence, on urgency, not patience. But then he was different, or at least he was trying to be. By morning, the sky had cleared. Pale sunlight spilled across the cabin floor, and the scent of pine smoke drifted in with the breeze. Clara rose early and stepped out into the snow-covered clearing, boots crunching quietly beneath her. Behind her, the cabin door creaked. Richard emerged, squinting against the light, pulling at his coat tighter. "You're up early," he said, joining her. She shrugged. "Old habit, the world feels quieter at dawn, more honest." He followed her gaze toward the mountains, their white peaks kissed by golden light. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low, "about when I go back, about the company, the foundation, the board meetings, and I keep wondering, how do I make it all mean something?" Clara looked at him. "Maybe it's not about what you build out there," she said. "Maybe it's about who you become because of here." He nodded slowly. "And if I stayed?" She blinked. "Stayed? I'm not saying forever. Just longer, long enough to help, long enough to learn." There was a silence between them, gentle and electric. And then Clara said softly, "Then I'll show you everything I know." And in that moment, it wasn't a declaration of love. It was something more enduring, a promise, the beginning of a life measured not by riches, but by roots. The days that followed were unlike any Richard had ever known. There were no meetings, no conference calls, no suits or spotlights. Just the rhythm of life among the trees, the rustle of the wind through the pines, the hiss of logs on the fire, the creak of the wooden floor as Clara moved through the house like memory in motion. Each morning, Richard woke to the scent of strong coffee and fresh bread, Clara already in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up and her braid tucked over one shoulder. She always greeted him with a quiet smile, one that said, "I see you," in a way no boardroom handshake ever had. She taught him to live slowly, how to track footprints in the snow, how to mend a broken snare, how to recognize the first bloom of spring beneath the frost. He learned to split logs without bruising his palms, to tell stories over tea without checking the time, to listen not just with his ears, but with his whole soul. And Clara was beginning to trust. She didn't say much about her past, not yet, but when she laughed, it reached all the way to her eyes. When she brushed against his shoulder by the fire, she didn't pull away. And when he told her one evening that the city lights had never made him feel as alive as chopping wood beside her in the snow, she didn't answer. She just leaned her head gently against his arm. It wasn't a confession. It was a truth that didn't need words. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars shimmer like distant campfires, Richard turned to her. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think I had everything, penthouse views, company shares, the kind of power that makes people say your name with a little more reverence." He paused. "But I never knew peace, not like this." Clara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the quiet glow of the lantern. "I never thought someone like you could find peace here." He turned, gently taking her hand. "I didn't find it," he said. "You gave it to me." She smiled, eyes softening, and in the stillness of the mountain night, two hearts, once strangers, began to beat in rhythm. The next morning brought a pale sun through the trees, casting long shadows over the snow. Richard stepped outside with a cup of steaming pine tea, he'd grown fond of its bitter warmth, and watched as Clara moved between the chicken coop and the woodpile, her coat dusted with frost, her breath hanging in the air like smoke. He couldn't remember ever watching someone move with so much quiet purpose. There was no rush in her world, only rhythm. A life measured not by deadlines, but by sunrises and snowfall. Back inside, he found himself at the small writing desk tucked in the corner of the cabin. It had once belonged to Clara's father, she'd told him, a carpenter who carved words as tenderly as he carved wood. Richard stared at the blank paper for a long while, then slowly began to write, Not an email, not a memo, but a letter to the man he used to be. Dear Richard, if you're reading this, then maybe, finally, you're listening. I want to talk to you, not as the billionaire, not as the CEO, but as the boy who used to run barefoot across his grandfather's orchard, the one who believed love could live in a porch swing and a song. You got lost. You forgot what it meant to sit still, to listen, to see someone, really see them, without weighing what they could give you in return. But then she found you, in the snow, in the silence, in the place between who you were and who you could become. She didn't care about your watch or your stocks or the name stitched inside your coat. She cared about you. So if you ever feel that hunger again, that ache for more, remember her hands, her voice, the sound of firelight breathing in a quiet cabin. Remember that the richest man in the world is the one who knows how to love without needing to own. And remember that home isn't where you store your suits. It's where your soul feels warm. Signed, the man you became. Richard folded the letter slowly, tucked it into the drawer of the old desk, and closed it with a quiet click. Outside, Clara was laughing, something about the stubborn rooster refusing to leave its perch. He smiled, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the morning. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't chasing anything. He was already where he needed to be. Spring came to the mountains slowly, like a memory returning. The snow melted in patient streams, trickling down into creeks that whispered to one another under the budding trees. Green returned to the world, and with it, a sense of new beginning. Richard had now lived with Clara and Martha for nearly 3 months. His leg had healed, though a slight stiffness still reminded him of what he'd endured. He no longer looked like the man who had once dominated boardrooms. His beard was fuller, his hands tougher, his eyes clearer. But the city still called. One morning, a letter arrived. Delivered by a local courier on snowshoes, the envelope bore the gold insignia of Caldwell Enterprises. Richard turned it over in his hands, his fingers hesitating at the seal. Clara noticed from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "You gonna open it?" she asked gently. He looked up. "I don't want it to pull me away from here." "Then don't let it," she said simply. But she understood. Some things had to be faced. Richard broke the seal. Inside was a single type page. "Mr. Caldwell, the investigation into Jonathan Reed has concluded. He has been charged with fraud, attempted murder, and corporate embezzlement. The board is requesting your presence to finalize new leadership and reestablish direction. We await your return. Caldwell Enterprises legal team." Richard exhaled slowly. Martha, who'd been quietly shelling peas by the fire, looked up. "Looks like the wolves are howling again." He folded the letter, tucking it into his coat. "I'll go, but just to finish things." Clara tilted her head. "And then?" Richard met her eyes. "I come back." She said nothing at first, just reached into her pocket and pulled out the small silver compass he had once given her. "It always pointed here," she said, "even before I met you." He took it from her gently, holding it like something sacred. 1 week later, New York City. The boardroom at Caldwell Enterprises had always felt like a battlefield. Glass walls, sleek marble floors, and voices sharpened by ambition. But this time it felt different. Richard stood at the head of the table, no longer in tailored suits, but in a simple blazer and worn boots. He looked at each board member with calm authority. "I've decided," he began, "to step away." A murmur ran through the room. "I'm placing the company in the hands of a new leadership team, one focused on sustainability, ethics, and transparency. I'm not here to grow empires anymore. I'm here to build something that matters." A pause. "And I'm starting with the Dawson Foundation." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were plans, real, tangible plans for education programs, rural medical assistance, environmental conservation. One of the board members leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, is this personal?" Richard smiled. "It's the most personal thing I've ever done." That evening in a private courtyard below the skyline, Richard stood with his old assistant Laura, a woman who had stood by his side through the rise and fall. "Are you really not coming back?" she asked. He looked up at the stars. "I've already found where I belong." Back in the mountains, Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, the silver compass warm in her palm. Then, far in the distance, she heard it, the soft bark of sled dogs, the familiar jingle of reins. She smiled, because some promises are made in silence, and some are kept with every beat of a changed heart. The summer sun draped the mountains in golden light, warming the fields of wildflowers that danced gently in the breeze. The snow was long gone, replaced by green meadows and the hum of bees weaving between yellow blooms. High above, eagles soared, and down below, in a quiet clearing near the Dawson cabin, something extraordinary was happening. Clara Dawson stood barefoot in the grass, the hem of her ivory dress brushing her ankles. It wasn't a traditional gown. It was simple, handmade from soft linen, embroidered by Martha and the village women. Her hair, usually tucked beneath a knit cap or tangled from the wind, now flowed in soft waves down her back, dotted with tiny wildflowers. Her eyes, always steady and practical, sparkled with something far more fragile: joy. The guests weren't many, just the village folk, Martha seated on a wooden bench beside the fire pit, a handful of friends Richard had brought from New York, and a local pastor who had come up the trail by mule that morning. The altar was no more than two pine logs bound together, wrapped in birch bark and wild lavender. And there, standing beneath it, was Richard Caldwell. He wore no tuxedo, just a soft gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, suspenders, and well-worn boots. His hands were rough, his hair a bit longer than it once was, and in his pocket, the compass rested like a secret vow. As Clara stepped into the clearing, every sound seemed to fade. The hush was so complete that even the birds held their breath. Richard turned, and when he saw her, his lips parted as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. His eyes welled with the same emotion he'd once felt in the hospital bed when he woke to find her beside him: hope. Clara joined him beneath the altar. They didn't need music. The wind through the trees was enough. The vows were short, heartfelt, spoken not in poetic grandeur, but in the soft, trembling words of two people who had walked through storm and silence to find each other. "I promise," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly, "to stand by you even when the firewood's wet, the stew is burnt, and you miss every shot with the bow." Laughter rolled through the crowd like thunder, warm, genuine. "I promise," Richard said, his hand tightening around hers, "to never forget what really matters. To hold on to this, us, even when the world tries to pull me back." When they kissed, it wasn't the kind of kiss that made headlines. It was quiet, slow, full of the things that don't need words: gratitude, awe, and the kind of love that is built over time, like a fire stoked on cold nights. That night, as the stars blinked awake, the celebration continued under lanterns strung between trees. There was music, a fiddle, a tin whistle, and Martha clapping along with surprising rhythm. There was food, laughter, and stories shared by firelight. Clara and Richard danced barefoot, swaying gently as fireflies glowed around them like blessings. At one point, Clara leaned into him and whispered, "So, Mr. Caldwell, do you still think gold mines are your greatest treasure?" He smiled, resting his forehead against hers. "No," he said, "I found something far rarer, and she has calloused hands, a stubborn streak, and a heart big enough to carry two lives." Later, when the guests had gone and the fire burned low, they sat on the porch wrapped in an old blanket. The stars stretched above them like old friends. Clara leaned against his chest, her breath steady. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked quietly. "When I found you in the snow?" Richard nodded. "Every day." Clara turned to him. "Why do you think you survived?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because someone refused to let me die," he said. "Because love doesn't let go." And with that, they sat in silence, hand in hand, hearts finally home. Years passed, but the story of Clara Dawson and Richard Caldwell didn't fade. It deepened, like the rings inside the tall pines that surrounded their home. Their love had started in silence, born of frostbite and firelight, but it grew into something far richer, something generations would remember. The cabin, once a humble shelter against the storm, had been expanded with Richard's help. Not lavishly, no marble floors or golden fixtures, just honest, sturdy rooms with wide windows to let in the mountains, warm wood floors, and shelves overflowing with books, herbs, and hand-carved toys. On the mantel above the hearth hung the compass Richard had once given Clara. It no longer pointed north, it pointed to her. They raised two children there, Eli and Nora, both with their mother's fierce independence and their father's quiet strength. The children grew up learning to hunt, to read the stars, to understand both numbers and nature. Clara taught them how to fish and heal with herbs. Richard taught them how to build, not just structures, but ideas, and more importantly, how to build trust. Richard never returned fully to the world of skyscrapers and quarterly reports. Instead, he managed his company from afar, transforming Caldwell Enterprises into a force for good. Under his leadership, it funded schools in underserved areas, brought clean water to forgotten places, and provided shelter to those left behind. And through it all, Clara remained his compass, guiding every decision back to the human heart. Together, they founded the Pine Foundation, a nonprofit that blended the best of both their worlds, offering real-world skills, self-sufficiency training, and education to rural communities. The cabin became its headquarters, where people came not just to learn how to survive, but how to live with dignity. Every summer, young people from across the country would arrive in buses and trucks, drawn not by glamour, but by the quiet magic they'd heard in the story of a woman who saved a man in the snow. They listened as Clara spoke of storms and kindness, of the weight of an axe and the miracle of sharing soup with someone you love. And they watched Richard, who used to wear suits that cost more than their cars, kneel in the dirt beside his daughter, planting tomatoes with his hands. In time, the village grew too. Roads were repaired, power lines extended, and the small schoolhouse expanded. Clara and Richard never took credit. It was the people, they'd say. They were always strong. They just needed a little shelter from the storm. Martha passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn, wrapped in her favorite quilt, the wood stove humming quietly in the corner. At her funeral, Clara stood tall, reading a letter her grandmother had left behind. "You were always meant to carry others," the letter read, "not because you're strong, but because you know what it feels like to be cold, and you'd never let someone freeze alone." In their old age, Clara and Richard would sit beneath the same stars that once lit their first kiss, their hair silver, their hands still searching for each other in the dark. When asked what the secret was, Clara always answered the same way. "Kindness," she'd say. "It begins in the smallest moments. That's where life changes." And so the story lived on, not in headlines or stock tickers, but in wood smoke curling from a chimney, in the hush of a snowfall, and in the way a stranger might lend a hand without being asked. Final words. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you of the power of kindness, of second chances, of building something beautiful from broken pieces, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories. We'll keep bringing you the tales that matter, not just for today, but for a lifetime. Until next time, dear listener, stay kind, stay hopeful, and always believe in the warmth of strangers.